Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Ayo Edebiri thinks something is very wrong with John Malkovich in the A24 horror Opus. Ariel Ecton, played by Ayo Edebiri, is a young journalist struggling to make her mark. When the reclusive pop star Alfred Moretti, played by John Malkovich, releases his first album in 30 years, Ariel is mysteriously invited to join a small group of journalists to Moretti's private compound for the launch. But once there, Ariel is increasingly unnerved by the cult that Moretti has surrounded himself with, who call themselves the Levelers. Opus is the feature directorial debut of Mark Anthony Green, who was the former editor of GQ and wrote there for 13 years, which certainly explains the film's print media background. And because of that job, Green has obviously spent a lot of time in the company of celebrities doing interviews, so he's obviously put a fair bit of his own experience into the film, but hopefully with less cults. Green, however, has always wanted to be a filmmaker, and he left GQ to pursue his ambition. He's been working on the script for Opus for 6 years, and he wrote it with Ayo Edebiri in mind for the lead even before she recently blew up because of her role in The Bear. And for someone who has spent all that time around celebrity, there's definitely a lot of room for a potential cutting satire on the idea that they're famous because they're better than us. As a journalist and interviewer, there's an inherent weirdness to going out and spending a few days in the company of people whose fame means that they're isolated in their own little bubbles away from the outside world, which makes it very unfortunate that not only is Opus pretty far from being a masterpiece, it hits a lot of bum notes along the way. To Opus's credit, the first half shows plenty of early promise, and a lot of that is down to the casting of Edebiri in the lead role. Edebiri's Ariel is desperate to try and prove herself, but she's not been getting the opportunities to actually do so. Her boss Stan, played by Murray Bartlett, is more than happy to hear her pitches, and then give them to other writers, as well as try and take the credit and the best opportunities for himself. Stan is also far more enamored with being in the company of celebrity than Ariel is, as he accompanies her to Moretti's compound, and he's openly happy to see the return of the kind of big junkets that he used to hang out with his fellow journalists on. Ariel, on the other hand, is much more of an opportunist. She talks about how she plans to write about celebrities because, quote, they're inherently more interesting, by which she means they're an easy way to get published, and move on to the things that she actually wants to write. But her friend Ken, played by young Mazzino, tells Ariel that her writing doesn't pop because she lacks actual life experience, and honestly, she's in the middle, but most people are. And yes, it is very weird that he calls it the middle. Don't we call that mid these days? Or to put it another way, she's basic. And now that Ariel's been personally selected to meet Moretti, it's a chance to finally prove herself. But because she's far more skeptical of celebrity culture, she almost immediately starts getting some very strange vibes even before she ventures into Moretti's compound. And Edebiri is mostly known for comedy, especially in her big screen roles with only a few exceptions. And while she does bring some of that to her initial interactions, like jotting creepy greeter in her notes, this is actually her in a much more serious straight role. The discomfort and anxiousness that she often uses in her humour, especially in her physicality and expressions, is instead mined for tension. She's almost constantly weirded out by the sycophantic behaviour by her levelers and the way that they follow and watch the journalist's movements constantly, with Ariel getting her own personal surveillance in the form of Amber Midthunder's Belle. Amber Midthunder, of course, being from Prey, and actually co-starring in Novocaine, which was released on exactly the same day as this was. And Edebiri proves that she's more than capable of holding her own in a horror film, as the more the film goes on, the more she feels that something is deeply wrong and is just desperate to leave. Edebiri makes her responses feel credible and relatable, and she makes this more engaging. To a point. But the big showy role is obviously John Malkovich, in probably some of the best work he's done in quite some time. Malkovich has actually spent quite a few years slumming it in low-budget direct-to-video streaming movies for the cash, so this is a return to form for him, playing an archetypal Malkovich role, someone who's eccentric with a dangerous and menacing side with a superiority complex. And that description pretty much fits Moretti down to a T, although buying John Malkovich as someone who is the world's most famous pop star is a bit of a stretch, let alone someone who is famous for his wiggle. It's worth noting the film has music from Nile Rodgers and The Dream, who are also executive producers, and they created the original songs for Moretti, which are genuinely good tracks. They almost have this kind of electro dance vibe with a seductive, haunting edge, but also just that little bit strange, and you can kind of understand why people are so enthralled to him. The character is basically a grab bag of a load of different pop stars, so you've got elements of Jared Leto, David Bowie, Michael Jackson, even Charles Manson, all just kind of mashed up together, and Malkovich is given full license to just ham it up, playing a tightrope of being scary and funny in just how weird he is. You get scenes where Moretti puts on a Daft Punk style helmet and starts dancing and gyrating to one of his songs, grinding up against the journalist, or talking to his disciples as he starts crawling across the floor. It's a big, showy performance, and one that tries its best to hide the fact that Moretti is not entirely a consistent character, or even defined all that well. The film doesn't even really explain specifically why he disappeared for so long in the first place. What clearly drives Moretti, though, is a desire to be worshipped for his art, and to be so unquestionably, so he's surrounded himself with people who hang on his every word and thought, and believes in his inherent superiority and meritocracy because he's a genius creator. The Levelers are driven by their own devotion to the creative arts as being the highest form of human expression, and many of them are giving up their own past lives when Moretti contacted them, almost like they were touched by the hand of God himself. You can see the obvious parallels to modern day fandoms of celebrities, which are so intensely protective of their favourites that we're willing to fight other fandoms or individuals on their behalf. There's a reason why the term "stan" from the Eminem song has entered the mainstream, because these are basically a church of stans. Green sums this up in the film's key scene, which is a big old symbolism moment. Moretti shows Ariel the Leveler ritual of shucking open oysters to find pearls, which is a metaphor built on multiple levels. For instance, it's partly to do with the idea of creativity and striving for success, about finding that brilliant idea that makes you famous, that rare pearl. But it's also reinforcing the idea of selectiveness, that only a chosen few will become famous because they are the pearl, and they should be prized and cherished. The Levelers all bear scars on their hands because of this process, and what Green is saying is that fame inherently leaves a mark, that there is something about it that is inherently damaging, and Moretti takes that to an extreme. Likewise, there's a later scene with a rat puppet show about Billie Holiday that is a critique about the way the press treats celebrities, asking questions that alternate between asinine and invasive about how the press destroys celebrities for sport. Obviously, we're not meant to entirely agree with all that, because Moretti is clearly unhinged, but these moments where Green puts his commentary close to the surface are its strongest, and if you told me that he came up with these scenes and constructed the rest of the film around them, I'd believe it, and that's because Green doesn't really knit these big ideas into a cohesive script. Opus has a lot of story issues, and one of the biggest is that it doesn't nail the tone. In fact, there's a rather obvious lack of horror in Opus for a long stretch of it. There's not enough suspense or sense of menace being built up, and the satire isn't funny or sharp enough to make up for that. The supporting cast is very underdeveloped, especially the fellow invited, like Juliette Lewis, as a TV chat show host who is given very little to do at all. There's also an influencer, a paparazzi, and a fellow musician that Moretti has had a feud with, and fleshing out these characters into more than just one-dimensional types would have helped give it a bit more substance. It's one of those horror films that knows it's struggling to set an atmosphere, so it kills off one of the characters very early on so that we know that something sinister is happening, because otherwise there's very little to create a sense of terror. And there is this idea that all the other attendees just shrug off their increasingly dwindling numbers or make excuses for Moretti's behaviour because they want to keep their access and exclusives, but the film never quite pries that out. But it's the second half where Opus rapidly falls apart. For a long while I was patient with it as it takes its time, that surely it must be leading somewhere. The characters all get itineraries, there must be a grand plan on Moretti's part. And then the movie plays its hand, and there isn't really. He just starts killing them, and there's no real theatricality or inventiveness to it. It just shatters all that intrigue and promise that have been built up because you wait so long to go, is that it? There's so little payoff after all the build-up, and it just feels rushed through. Moretti's motivations are so simplistic and obvious that they're casually mentioned in a late exposition dump, and the more that you think about it, the more the film completely falls apart in retrospect. Like, what is the point of doing most of the theatrics if that was the plan? If he can just kill one of them without much fanfare, why doesn't he just do that for everyone else instead of building to a sense of ritual that goes nowhere? The answer, of course, is there wouldn't be much of a movie without it, but Opus is filled with faulty logic. Not least when the film adds a final sting in the tale where Moretti apparently had a crystal ball and knew exactly how things would play out, even though if you watch the film in the moment, the way that several characters act doesn't line up at all with this final reveal. It tries to pull the rug so hard trying to be clever that it ends up pulling it out from under itself. But perhaps the reason why the film struggles to build suspense might also be down to the fact that it all feels so familiar. Opus feels very much like if you constructed the plot of an A24 movie out of a fridge magnet set. It all feels very tropey. Opus feels very reminiscent of so many of these social commentary horror films we've had over the last several years, where they were produced by A24 or not. I spent a lot of it comparing it to Blink Twice, and while those similarities are coincidental as they were being made at the same time, that movie is a so much more confident debut feature than this one. But the art criticism satire evokes The Menu, the cultists in broad daylight feels like Midsummer. It even does that trendy aspect ratio shift thing, and even that works against it because most of the film is in scope, and then in the final couple of minutes it expands out as a character's mind is being blown. What this means though is that it undermines the mostly beautiful cinematography because no matter where you see this in a cinema, you're going to get black bars at the top and bottom for almost the entire film, or even worse, like I did, window boxed on all four sides on a scope screen. I genuinely thought it was being projected wrong, but no, it turns out it's an awful distracting affectation. Of course, it's taking the most from the forebearer of this kind of film, Get Out. Now that wasn't an A24 flick, but they certainly codified it and made it into a formula that they've used in their original horror films. Opus pretty shamelessly wants to be Get Out for journalists, but Jordan Peele's film felt genuinely fresh and different, and it still holds up to this day. But Opus feels like tired, reheated cliches. It wants so hard to be Get Out or any of these other films that it doesn't develop an identity of its own. I'm being quite tough on Opus, but that's because I was so disappointed by it. Some of the commentary on celebrity and creativity does have some bite, but it's stranded in a script that doesn't work as a story on its own terms. And if it wasn't for Ayo Edebiri and John Malkovich carrying this wouldn't work for as long as it does. But even then, they can't stop this from becoming a frustrating mess. A lot of clever, inventive original horror films have followed in the footsteps of Get Out, but this misses the mark, and it all feels so routine. It isn't completely terrible, but to quote the film, it's very much in the middle. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can join the commune over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.